Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and you found the Christian channel that loves atheists. And today we're going to be responding to something that fortunately doesn't usually come up at the academic level, although we do have an example of an atheist professor making this mistake. And then we're going to look at how that can have an effect on YouTube as well, and unfortunately could cause some people some confusion about what's actually being said, could clutter up our attention and approach to the arguments and evidences when we're looking at that, and could, if someone doesn't see the problem in it, could cause unnecessary doubt about the Christian faith. And so we want to, or about the arguments that we use to support the Christian faith. And so we want to cover those things and talk about them today in just briefly here. So a couple of years ago, I'm going to come back to the YouTuber, which I'm sure is one of the reasons why many of you are here. But before I get there, a couple of years ago, Dr. Jonathan Pritchett and myself went through an argument from another professor, a professor at a school in California. And he was talking about, he was giving and providing objections to William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam cosmological argument. And so we went through all of the stuff that he said there, all of the technical objections to the premises of the argument, and whether you can have a past eternal universe, and whether actual infinites, and all those kind of things that come up when you talk about the argument. But then toward the end, he gave us what he considers to be the biggest problem, or the most serious problem, with the Kalam cosmological argument. And it sets us up for taking a look at what this YouTuber has said. So let's go ahead and listen to what he has to, what this individual has to say, what Craig's remarks are, and then what the professor says about those remarks. Now, this is a little bit of a lengthy clip, so I'm only telling you that because it's not going to stay on this forever, but maybe 2 or 3 minutes to get the context of this clip right before we move on. So I hope that you'll stick around with us, because this is going to be useful, I think.
The next objection I'd like to consider, perhaps the most serious objection, seems to come from Craig himself. When Craig is asked for response to a question about how to deal with doubt or criticisms of one's reasons for believing in God, he has this to say.
First of all, I think that I would tell them that they need to understand the proper relationship between faith and reason. And my view here is that the way in which I know Christianity is true is first and foremost on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. And that this gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing that Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And therefore, if in some historically contingent circumstances the evidence that I have available to me should turn against Christianity, I don't think that controverts the witness of the Holy Spirit. In such a situation, I should regard that as simply a result of the contingent circumstances that I'm in, and that if I were to pursue this with due diligence and with time, I would discover that in fact the evidence, if I could get the correct picture, would support exactly what the witness of the Holy Spirit tells me.
This is really a quite remarkable thing that Craig says here. He knows that Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And what he said is that he is going to subordinate reason to that article of faith. Now, we were taking the Kalam.
Now, I just want to say real quickly here, I'm hoping that you're noticing that he even has, this professor even has on the slide as the top bullet point, the most serious objection to Craig's argument appears to come from Craig himself. In other words, he not only says that it is, but he even puts it on the PowerPoint that this issue that we're talking about now, that he's addressing, is the most serious issue with the Kalam. Keep that in mind, and I want to see if some of you who are not even maybe interested too much in philosophy or studied philosophy or these kind of things, if you can already see the problem in what he's saying here. It seems obvious if you think about it closely.
Argument to be an appeal to the evidence to prove that God exists. We were trying, and I thought Craig was trying, but we were trying to figure out what caused the universe. But it turns out that what Craig is up to is something very different, despite it looking like he's after the same answer. So imagine that we conduct an investigation into all of the evidence we have. We're open to any possible outcome. We gather all of the relevant evidence in as objective and fair and broad a way possible. And then we apply the canons of deductive and inductive logic, and we draw the conclusion that is then indicated by that evidence. So that's a fair and unbiased investigation where we're neutral with regard to what conclusion is the outcome. And it would have appeared that the Kalam argument was that sort of inquiry. But here we've realized now that what Craig's actually doing is something very different. Craig already believes the conclusion. He is determined to subordinate reason to that. He believes it wholly apart from the evidence. And what he's actually engaged in is a search for evidence or a construction of argument that must be driven or directed by the conclusion that he's already accepted prior. That is, Craig admits that he won't allow that any evidence could possibly count against his faith. Reason is subordinate to faith. So Craig won't countenance any argument or evidence that doesn't corroborate his theism. He's not prepared to consider any of that. So, for example, take all of the objections that I've just listed off in the past several slides. Now, Craig has and will object vociferously to all of those objections, and he'll maintain that his argument is still sound. But now something different has happened in the way we should treat his argument, because it looks like Craig has disqualified the Kalam argument from serious rational consideration, given his prior commitment to one and only one conclusion.
Now, I want you to notice what was just said there. This individual is saying that that Craig has disqualified, that Craig himself has disqualified an argument that existed before he was born. He has disqualified this argument from rational consideration because Craig would believe, even if he didn't have the Kalam cosmological argument. And so this disproves, or this disqualifies the Kalam from serious consideration. I hope you can see, well, I'll tell you what, I'm not even going to say it myself. I actually have a clip here that I'm going to play from Dr. Craig, because this is the number one. And I think this came out before the professor made these statements, but this is in a list that Craig created of the worst objections to the Kalam so bad that he couldn't have come up with them. This objections to the Kalam cosmological argument he gives for God's existence, which of course, for anyone that doesn't know, is whatever begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause for its existence. And then there's a conceptual analysis done to figure out what we can know about that cause. And so Craig spoke at, I think, Biola University, and gave the objections so bad to the Kalam that he couldn't even make them up. Here's what he has to say about this objection.
Craig says that he believes in God on the basis of the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit in his heart, not on the basis of the Kalam cosmological argument. In fact, he says that even if the argument were refuted, he would still believe in God. This is blatant hypocrisy on Craig's part. Response to objection number one. The problem with this objection is that even if I were a hypocrite, there's just no relationship between the soundness of an argument and the psychological state of the person propounding it. The objector is thus guilty of putting forth a textbook example of an argument ad hominem, that is to say, trying to invalidate a position by attacking the character of the person who defends it. So what does make for a sound deductive argument? The answer is true premises and valid logic. True premises and valid logic. An argument is sound if the premises of the argument are true and the conclusion follows from the premises by the rules of logic. The soundness of the Kalam cosmological argument is thus entirely independent of me. The argument was, after all, defended by the medieval Muslim theologian Al-Ghazali 1,000 years before I was born. If the argument is sound, it was sound then. If the argument is sound, it was sound during the Jurassic period, before anyone had propounded it. My alleged hypocrisy just has nothing to do with the soundness of the argument.
And that's what we really want to point out here. And I think probably many of you saw it when the good professor was going on about what Craig had to say about this. Craig is saying that if he didn't have the evidence, wholly apart from the evidence, that he would still probably be a Christian, that he would still believe on the basis of the Holy Spirit. Now, I don't know how Craig would terminologically say this, but I would say that that is a form of evidence, that the witness of the Holy Spirit is a form of evidence, though it's internal and not publicly accessible to other people. I mean, perhaps they could say something like he lives a different life now that he's a Christian. The reformer of the Holy Spirit is at work in his life to make, those sorts of things are true. And if you're living the Christian life, we would expect you to be living the Christian life, and that you would be changed by the work of the Holy Spirit, convicting you of sin and encouraging you toward righteousness. However, I consider that to be a form of evidence for the individual. And that's why I think that Craig would say something similar, is why he always says what he says in this video, which is that it's because of the internal witness of the Holy Spirit that I know Christianity is true. But it's through the production of evidence and providing arguments and reasons and evidences that apologetics, that we show that Christianity is true. And those are two very different things. But this individual seems to say that William Lane Craig has invalidated an entire argument, or even family of arguments perhaps, but we'll just stick with the Kalam, that he's disqualified this type of argument from consideration because of how Craig approaches things, or how Craig personally thinks, or that if this argument wasn't there, that he would still be a Christian. This is completely illogical. It's surprising to find this at this level. Now, what it could tell you is, okay, be aware when you're looking at Craig's arguments that he may have a bias here. But of course, most of the atheists that I know who are doing work on Craig's arguments, and the ones who are popularizing atheist responses to them on YouTube as best they can, those people would say that we have to go check out everything that someone says anyway, whether they're an atheist or a Christian or a Hindu or a Muslim or a scientist or a philosopher or whatever. We need to go check what they're saying to see if what they're telling us is true. So even Craig's bias just means, well, don't take what he says at face value. Look at it yourself. Go to sources that you trust and find out whether it's true. But you simply can't say that because, so you could say maybe from this realization that, well, I think that Craig is biased and therefore I need to look more closely at this argument. But I don't think you could say based on his comments here, therefore this kind of argument should be disqualified. By the way, a word chosen selectively because it can't be that it disproves it, but I don't know what does disqualify mean, that you don't think we should care about it anymore because of Craig's personal feelings about Christianity? Well, tough luck. The fact is he gave an argument. You've got to deal with that argument. So how does this now come to bear on YouTube? Well, there is a YouTuber by the name of Pine Creek. And Pine Creek, way back when I first kind of started really working at YouTube and making response videos to atheists, I made one video that was a response to both Pine Creek and Godless Engineer. And the reason I did that was because they had both made response videos regarding my debate with Matt Dillahunty. I didn't think I was going to be making response videos to atheists just a whole lot, although now I have made a lot of them. At the time, I thought I'll just knock these both out with one video. But as I've been seeing people make this mistake more and more, surprisingly, and especially like they'll point to Craig and say, yeah, but Craig says he would believe even if he didn't have the Kalam. When I see that kind of thing come up in comments, and when I see atheist YouTubers say things like, you'd still be a Christian if you didn't have that argument, right? Yeah, probably. Oh, well, then that argument is apparently useless or not powerful or not that great or whatever. And this, again, is to make the same, even in a less formal way and on a less formal platform. It's still very much making the same point, which is because the Christian would still be a Christian regardless of this argument, we can dismiss this argument. All right, let's take a look at what Pine Creek has to say about this. And I had raised my argument, if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. Libertarian freedom does exist, therefore God exists. And here's part of what Pine Creek has to say in response.
Okay, so my question to Braxton would be, if you became convinced someday that you are not free, would you leave Christianity? I honestly don't know how he would answer that. I actually think he'd say no. I think if he became convinced someday that we are not free in the libertarian sense, the ability to do otherwise, I think he would still be a Christian. And I think he would still believe in God. And I think most believers would answer that way. So really, is this an argument? Is this free will argument really that powerful? Does it really mean anything if you became convinced that there was absolutely no free will, the ability to do otherwise, if you would still believe in God, still believe in Christianity, then what are we really talking about here?
Yeah, so he says there, if you would still be a Christian, even if you found out you didn't have libertarian freedom, and really what he's saying is there, if you found out that you didn't have the force that you think you have, Braxton, with this libertarian free will argument, if you didn't have this reason to believe that God exists, would you still be a Christian? Yes. Oh, well then he says, and I quote, is it really that powerful? Is it really that powerful? So he's trying to say these arguments aren't good if they aren't part of what convinces you. Now, it may not be obvious to you right away, but what is he saying? He's saying this argument isn't really that impressive if you, Braxton Hunter, would still be a Christian if you didn't have this argument. And this brings me to an example that I gave in that video that came to me kind of in the moment, I think, if I remember correctly, that Pine Creek loves hypotheticals. He loves examples. He loves analogies. So I'm going to give him one. And it's not the flying man. And it's not the poof or drown, but it's the let's say the keychain analogy. Here's the keychain analogy, and he'll recall it even if you don't. The key ring analogy basically goes like this. Let's say that somebody told me that let's say I woke up, I left the house, my wife left the house just before I did, so I know she left the house. And let's not concern ourselves with my kids. My kids are at their grandparents' house or whatever for the weekend. But I get up and I leave to go somewhere. And my wife leaves just before I do. All right? And someone tells me, perhaps a trusted friend, tells me, your wife is not at home. Now don't worry about me telling you this, but there's something very important. You need to go home right now and go talk to her. Because your wife is at home. Trust me, she's at home. I'm telling you, I'm not wrong about this. Your wife is at home. Go home and talk to your wife. You need to talk to her about something. Okay, well, obviously, I see. It sounds like this is very important. It seems like there's a lot at stake here. So it seems like I need to find my wife wherever she's at. This trusted testimony that I have tells me she's at home. Okay, is that proof? No, that's not proof. So what do I need to do? I need to go home and find out. So I go home, and when I walk in the door, now I believe she's at home, because I trust the person that told me she was at home. But when I open the door, here's what I also see. I don't see her yet in our place. Our bedroom's at the very back of the place. It's a long, you go through. So I shouldn't expect to see her yet. So I open the door and I see there her shoes. Now, these are the shoes I saw her leave in this morning. Okay. So this is pretty good reason to believe that she's at home. Okay, so that helps. That's good reason to confirm what I already believe. I believe that on the basis of the trusted testimony I have. Now I have more reason to believe because I have these shoes that I know I saw her leave in today. And then I see her keychain, her key ring with her car key on the table, and sitting over there on the table. I just had to pick something, so this is the key ring analogy. So there's another thing. I've got the shoes, I've got the keys on the table. This is more reason to believe she really is home, and this is confirmatory. Then let's say I see her purse, and then I see her cell phone. Okay, these are all things I don't expect her to leave the home without, and I actually saw her leave with those shoes. So I've got all this reason to believe. What Pine Creek is saying to me is something like, if you didn't have, when he says, if you didn't have this libertarian free will argument, or if you found out you didn't have libertarian free will, would you still be a Christian? Yes, I'd probably be a Calvinist Christian. There are Christians who are determinists. I would have a lot of questions, but I would be a Calvinist Christian probably. And if you didn't have that libertarian free will or that libertarian free will argument, then is the argument really that impressive? Yes, because what you're asking me is like, what if you came home and you didn't find her cell phone there? You found the keys and the purse and the shoes, but you didn't find her cell phone there. Would you still believe that she was home? Yes. Oh, well, then the cell phone being there isn't very impressive as a reason to believe, is it? Well, yes, it still is very impressive. It's just that if I didn't, because I have that, I have even more reason to believe. But if I didn't have that, I would still have reason to believe. Okay, so so the argument that he's saying can be, like the professor may be, disqualified from our discussion. Let's not think too much about that. Why? Well, it wasn't part of what led you, Braxton, to become a Christian. It's not why you're a Christian, so it doesn't count for anything. Well, I came home to my house already believing my wife was there, but finding her cell phone was sure good confirmatory evidence. But if I didn't have it, would I still believe my wife is at home? Yes. If I didn't have the free will argument, would I still believe there's a God? Yes. If I didn't have the keys on the table, would I still believe my wife is home? Yes. If I didn't have the kalam, would I still believe that there's a God? Yes. If I didn't have the shoes, would I still believe she was at home? Yes. If I didn't have any of the theistic arguments, would I still believe? Yes. Because I came to the house, the condo, already believing she was there, but that doesn't mean those things aren't powerful in and of themselves for convincing other people who don't perhaps trust the testimony that I'm trusting, or to confirm my faith to myself. Yes, that's absolutely true. But they're very valuable for those things. It doesn't mean they don't matter. And in a similar way, and I take this frankly to be what Craig thinks about this, and I think this is most evident in 5 Views on Apologetics, where he actually talks with apologists from different perspectives that don't approach these things the way that he does exactly, some very differently than how he approaches them. And I think what you'll get is that, if you took away all of the external publicly available, I know he said wholly available evidence, but if you took away all the publicly accessible evidence, would I still be a Christian? Yes. Why? Because I believe I have the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit convicting me. And I do have still what I consider to be a trusted testimony. But that doesn't mean that I'm like, I still believe, but that doesn't mean if you give me good evidence, I'm still not going to love that and share that with others in hopes that it would convince them and all of those sorts of things. So I hope that this is helpful to you. Apologists don't matter. They don't matter to the truth. They matter to the provision and the proclamation of evidence, but they don't matter to truth. So when you're out there as an atheist or whatever, and you are saying, well, these apologists are all dishonest charlatans, even if that were true, it wouldn't make what they're saying, it wouldn't make the true things they're saying false. So you should already say about any particular person, whether it's an apologist or a counter-apologist, whether it's an evangelist or a street epistemologist, whatever it is, you should already not just take them at their word, but look into these things yourself. So calling them dishonest is just an insult, but it doesn't affect the true things that they're saying. And so really, I just wanted to point out this. And also, if you're a person out there who has been saying, I've heard this thing about, well, this isn't really the reason you became a Christian, is it? You became a Christian when you were a teenager because you thought God was dealing with your heart or whatever. It didn't have anything to do with apologetics. And you thought, well, that's true. So maybe, am I being disingenuous as a Christian promoting these apologetics when that's not what convinced me? No, you're like a person who already believed the wife was home, went home, or the husband, whichever way it goes, and you came home already believing that, but you found other people out there that don't believe, and so you say, okay, here's some evidence, and that would be like the keys, the purse, the cell phone, and all of those sorts of things. So this definitely shouldn't bother any Christian. It doesn't serve anyone in any seeker of truth. All it serves is the person who wishes not to have to deal with certain arguments, to have a way of disqualifying them from consideration because of the personality or the personal beliefs that are beyond the scope of just the argument that's being brought by the person giving the argument. And so I hope that this has been helpful to you, and I'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.